This is all that was left of the helicopter after the pilot made a series of fatal mistakes and crashed into the hillside, killing Kobe Bryant and everyone else on board. This was a terrible tragedy that never should have happened. That's why I'm going to share with you the shocking details of this investigation and the fatal mistakes that were made. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Our story begins on the morning of January 26, 2020, when Kobe Bryant, his 13-year-old daughter Gianna, and 6 other passengers boarded a private helicopter to fly from the John Wayne Airport in Orange County, California, to the Camarillo Airport just north of Los Angeles, not knowing they'd only have minutes left to live. When they were only about 25 miles from their destination, something went terribly wrong. Witnesses saw the helicopter flying below the clouds shortly before it disappeared, but the pilot never made any radio calls for help, and moments later they emerged from the clouds, crashing into the terrain, instantly killing everyone on board. The story immediately made international headlines because Kobe Bryant was one of the greatest players in the history of the NBA, and he had spent his entire 20-year career playing for the Los Angeles Lakers before retiring in 2016. Now, it's important to remember that although the death of Kobe and his daughter was very tragic, 6 other passengers died that day because of the fatal mistakes the pilot made, and their lives were just as valuable. Traveling with Kobe and his daughter Gianna was 56-year-old college baseball coach John Altobelli, his 46-year-old wife Carrie, and their 14-year-old daughter Alyssa, who is one of Gianna's teammates. Also on board was 45-year-old Sarah Chester and her 13-year-old daughter Peyton, along with 38-year-old Christina Mauser, who is an assistant basketball coach for Gianna and the girls. The only reason they were on the flight was because they were all headed to the girls' basketball game at the Mamba Sports Academy in Thousand Oaks, California, which was just a short drive from the Camarillo Airport. To better understand how this terrible tragedy took place, we need to start by looking at the man they all trusted to fly them safely to their destination. 50-year-old Ara Zabayan was the pilot flying the helicopter. He obtained his private pilot certificate in 2001, his commercial certificate in 2004, and he eventually became a flight instructor in 2008. Ara also had a certified flight instructor instrument rating, and that's a certificate that allowed him to train other pilots how to fly in the weather. By all accounts, Ara was a very experienced pilot, and he had about 8,500 total flight hours at the time of the crash, and that included about 1,250 hours in Sikorsky S-76 helicopters, which is what he was flying. Ara was hired by Island Express Helicopters in 2011, where he initially flew Airbus A-Star 350 helicopters, and eventually he was certified to fly the Sikorsky S-76 in 2014, and then he became the company's chief pilot in May of 2016. A few months later, he became a check airman, and that meant he was responsible for evaluating other pilots to work for the company. The truth is, all the evidence from the investigation indicated that Ara was a good pilot. Unfortunately, there are countless aviation accident reports that involve good pilots that either made a terrible mistake or found themselves in a bad situation, and this tragedy is certainly no exception. One of the things that was unique about Ara was that he was considered one of the most sought-after pilots by the rich and famous. Kobe Bryant was very particular about which pilot that he flew with, and he always requested to fly with Ara. The two had flown together for several years, and during that time their relationship turned more into a friendship where Kobe would eventually come to trust Ara enough to even fly his children by themselves. The aircraft they were all flying in on the day of the crash was a 1991 Sikorsky S-76B certified for single pilot operations. The helicopter was also equipped with a digital automatic flight control system that combines the autopilot and the flight director functions, providing the pilot with fully automatic flight path control. Basically, it had a really good autopilot system that the investigation discovered was fully functional at the time of the crash. We'll talk more about the helicopter later when we discuss what happened during the final moments of the flight. For now, it's important to know that the flight between the John Wayne Airport and Camarillo was one that Kobe and Ara had taken together 10 times in the year leading up to the crash. In fact, they even flew the same trip the day prior and they didn't have any issues. And although this should have been another routine flight, it only took a few minutes to turn deadly, and one of the reasons why was the weather. According to the investigation, the flight required a minimum of a half-mile visibility, visual reference to the surface, and a minimum altitude of 300 feet above ground level. However, company policy was more conservative, and Island Express required all of their flights to have 1 mile visibility, and they recommended pilots maintain between 500 and 1,000 feet above ground level. When it comes to flying in the weather, Island Express was approved by the FAA for VFR flights only. This meant that even though the helicopter was certified for single-pilot IFR flight and ARA had a valid instrument rating and was even an instrument instructor, he wasn't allowed to fly in the weather. He had to remain VFR in every flight that he did, but his training with the company still included emergency scenarios involving inadvertently flying into the weather, and he never had any problems with any of that training. On the day before the flight, a group text message was sent to everyone involved with Kobe's travel plans asking ARA about the weather, and he replied saying, "Not the best day tomorrow." However, at 7:30 and again at 8:20 the next morning, ARA confirmed that the weather would be okay for the 9 a.m. departure time. According to the investigation, the weather forecast that morning called for ceilings as low as 1,000 feet and visibility as low as 2 miles with mist and haze. And that was at the Van Nuys airport, which was located about 2/3 of the way to the destination. Now that might not seem like a big deal for helicopter pilots, but the problem is the potential for different weather between the airports. ARA was going to stay low, and that meant he needed to remain VFR, and there really wasn't any way of knowing how low the clouds were in that last segment of the flight between Van Nuys and Camarillo. The only clue he had, which was a really big one that he should have noticed, was that at 6:45 a.m. on the morning of the flight, the National Weather Service issued an AirMet Sierra advisory that forecast IFR conditions with mist, fog, and mountain obscuration for the area. This is very dangerous because this is what mountain obscuration looks like. The mountains or the ridges are obscured by the weather, so even though the clouds might be 1,000 feet above the ground down in the valley, they're going to hide the tops of the terrain, and you have no way of knowing how high that terrain goes. Now, ARA should have reviewed all of this and had a good understanding of the weather before the flight, and that brings us to his plan. ARA began his plan by filling out a flight risk analysis form that included 15 weather-related risk items, and based on the weather at that time, his risk score was low. Unfortunately, that was about 2 hours before takeoff, and because of the rapidly deteriorating weather, if he had completed or at least updated that form around the time of his departure, his score would have required him to contact the company director of operations because he needed a plan B alternative for the flight, and also he would have realized that his flight was going to require a special VFR clearance, which is something I'll explain a little bit later. Unfortunately, there was no record that ARA obtained a formal pre-flight weather briefing for the accident flight, and the NTSB couldn't determine what weather information he might have accessed when planning the flight. All we know for sure is that about 30 minutes prior to departure, ARA met up with the broker that was coordinating Kobe's trip, and he showed the broker the for-flight application on his phone. The map showed the Los Angeles, Van Nuys, and Burbank airports were all colored red, meaning a ceiling of 500 to 1,000 feet and visibility 1 to 3 miles. After showing the broker the map, ARA explained he was going to go up and around the weather so he could go east and north of the clouds. The investigation would reveal that ARA had canceled flights before due to bad weather, and there was never any pressure from the company for pilots to make flights happen. Everyone that flew for Island Express knew they could always set the helicopter down somewhere else if the weather got bad during the flight, and then they would just call for a limo to transport the passengers the rest of the way. On the morning of the flight, the director of operations for Island Express checked the weather and determined that the flight could be completed safely, but it would likely require a delay of 30 minutes to an hour. Tragically, he didn't discuss the weather or share his thoughts with ARA because he believed the pilot was more than capable of making his own decisions. Despite the risk of the deteriorating conditions and the uncertainty of the weather between the airports, ARA took off with Kobe and the other passengers at 9:07 a.m. The helicopter, call sign November 72 Echo X-Ray, departed John Wayne Airport to the northeast, maintaining altitudes of 400 to 600 feet over the rising terrain and a ground speed of 140 to 150 knots. When they got north of Los Angeles, they needed to transition through the airspace around the Burbank and Van Nuys airports, and when ARA contacted the Burbank tower controller, listen to what he was told.
72 Echo X-Ray, Burbank Tower, Burbank altimeter 3019, Burbank Class Charlie, surface area is IFR, stay intentions.
8% maintain, special VFR action for special VFR transition on the 101 westbound 2.
November 2 Echo X-Ray, hold outside Burbank Class Charlie airspace. I have an aircraft going around.
2 Echo X-Ray holding.
The first thing the controller said was the weather is so bad right now that the airport is only available for IFR traffic. And because ARA is on a VFR flight plan, the controller was asking him what he wanted to do. He replied saying that he wanted to get a special VFR clearance and follow the 101 westbound, which is the highway just south of the airport. Now, I mentioned special VFR clearance earlier, and this is something that a pilot can request that allows him to operate under visual flight rules but with reduced weather requirements. Fixed-wing pilots need at least 1 mile visibility and they must remain clear of clouds, whereas helicopter pilots don't have a minimum visibility requirement, but they still need to remain clear of the clouds. This is all perfectly legal and there is nothing wrong with ARA making this request. In fact, the weather at Burbank was overcast at 1,100 feet with 2.5 miles visibility, so ARA wasn't doing anything dangerous. However, IFR traffic is always going to have a priority, so that's why he ended up holding outside the Burbank airspace for about 15 minutes waiting to get through. He was eventually cleared to follow I-5 Northwest and then told to follow the 118 and contact the Van Nuys Tower and listen to what happened next.
Van Nuys helicopter 2 Echo X-ray with you for the special VFR transition. We are currently at 1400.
Helicopter 72 Echo X-ray Van Nuys Tower. Wind calm, visibility 2 1/2, feeling 1,100 overcast, Van Nuys altimeter 3016. Cleared into Van Nuys class Delta, northeast of Van Nuys along the 118 freeway westbound. Advise when you're in VFR conditions or when you're clear of the Van Nuys class Delta. Transition at or below 2,500 permitting.
2 Echo X-ray, advise in VFR condition, and then we stay on the 118, so we're currently at 1400, and we have 0235.
So far, things are still good. The weather is the same as it was at Burbank, and the controller told him to advise when he's clear of the airspace or when he's VFR. Now, at this point, he's flying about 500 feet above the ground, but pay attention because the next part is very important.
Tower report 2 Echo X-ray, can we go ahead and start turning to the southwest towards the 1-1?
Helicopter 2 Echo X-ray approved, and are you transitioning in VFR condition?
VFR condition 1,500, 2 Echo X-ray.
Helicopter 2 Echo X-ray, thank you. Contact SoCal now 134.2 for flight following 34-2.
34-2.
The controller asked him if he was VFR and he said that he was. The reason this is so important is because it establishes the fact that he was no longer on a special VFR clearance and he was now switched to a new controller for VFR flight following, which is an advisory service. This is not a service where the controller gives you altitudes and headings to fly. IFR traffic is still the priority for the controller, and it is 100% the responsibility of the VFR pilot to avoid obstacles in terrain while also remaining clear of clouds. Unfortunately, at this point, they only have about 5 minutes left to live.
SoCal helicopter 72 Echo X-ray with you transitioning in VFR condition at 1,500 to Camarillo.
Helicopter 72 Echo X-ray SoCal approach, roger. And you just going to stay down low at that for all the way to Camarillo?
Yes, sir. Low altitude 2 Echo X-ray.
2 Echo X-ray, roger. I'm going to lose radar and comms with you probably pretty shortly, so you can just squawk VFR, and when you get closer, go to Camarillo Tower.
Copy that. We'll squawk VFR 2 Echo X-ray.
ARA said he was transitioning in VFR conditions at 1,500. He was talking about an MSL altitude because at that point he was 500 feet above the ground, and his plan is to continue the rest of the flight down low below the weather. Now, technically, the controller should have said radar service is terminated, but that's a minor point because when the controller told him that he was going to lose radar and comms, he's basically telling ARA, you're too low and I'm not going to have radar coverage to see you, and I probably won't be able to talk to you at some point either because of the terrain. For the next 4 minutes, ARA would continue flying west, following the 101, and during that time, his ground speed increased from 120 to over 140 knots. However, look carefully at the 2-minute segment from 9:42 to 9:44. The green line represents the terrain, and it's starting to rise as ARA is getting closer to the mountains ahead. The problem is the clouds aren't rising, so even though his MSL altitude stayed roughly level at 1,400 feet, he's trying to stay below the weather and he was getting closer to the ground, going as low as about 400 feet above ground level. I also want to point out that ARA had about 4 minutes to assess the situation, and it's just shocking to me that a pilot with that much experience would look out at the weather in front of him and think that it's a good idea to not only continue straight ahead, but to speed up. Instead, he needed to slow down so he could assess the situation and make the appropriate decision. This is an image taken just moments before the crash, showing the helicopter right around 9:44, about to disappear into the clouds. This was very dangerous because inadvertently flying into the weather in a helicopter is extremely disorienting. In fact, according to the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, most helicopter pilots that unintentionally continue a VFR flight into the weather will very likely lose control and be dead within 56 seconds. This is why ARA has been specifically trained in how to recover from this situation. All you had to do was begin a climb at 75 to 80 knots, maintain that speed, then turn on the autopilot and declare an emergency. Now perhaps that was his plan, because listen to what he said.
SoCal 4 helicopter 2 Echo X-ray. We're going to go ahead and start our climb to go above the layers, and we're going to stay with you here.
2 Echo X-ray, where are you?
Just west of Van Nuys, 2 Echo X-ray.
2 Echo X-ray, yeah, you're still on a 1200 code. Are you requesting flight following?
Yes, sir, 2 Echo X-ray.
And 2 Echo X-ray, what do you say intentions?
We're climbing to 4,000, 2 Echo X-ray.
If you noticed, he didn't declare an emergency or say that he was about to fly into the weather. There's no sense of urgency or panic in his voice, and in my opinion, his radio call gives you the impression that he's found a hole in the clouds where he can maintain VFR on the climb. Unfortunately, the truth is he put himself in a bad situation, and now he's in the weather and he has no way out except to climb higher. The controller still can't see him on radar, and when ARA said he was climbing to 4,000 feet, that would be the last radio call he would make. They crashed just a few seconds later, and now it's time to share with you the truth about the fatal mistakes he made. ARA was undoubtedly a highly experienced helicopter pilot, and he was well respected by his friends and his colleagues. However, the truth was that even though he had a valid instrument rating, he only had about 75 hours of instrument time in the Sikorsky S-76, and 68 of those hours were under simulated instrument conditions. This meant he only had about 7 hours of experience flying on instruments in the weather. When ARA entered the weather, he quickly became spatially disoriented, and when he said he was in a climb to 4,000 feet, the truth was he was already in a descending left turn and plummeting toward the ground. It only took 1 minute from the time he started the climb into the clouds until the time they impacted the terrain. The NTSB said ARA probably had self-induced pressure to make sure Kobe got where he needed to be, especially because the two had developed a close friendship over the years. He also likely had planned continuation bias, which is a situation where unconsciously you're biased to stick with your plan even as your situation gets worse, and this is commonly referred to as get there-itis, and that bias only becomes stronger the closer you get to your destination. This was an extremely unfortunate tragedy caused by a series of fatal mistakes, and if there's only one lesson that pilots take away from this video, it's that your number one job is to keep everyone safe, even if that means you have to say no or turn the aircraft around when the conditions warrant. If you want to see another video about a helicopter pilot out in California that made a mistake and destroyed 2 helicopters, then be sure to check out this video on the screen with the full footage of the mishap. And I want to say thanks to all of my channel members and those of you that help support the channel on Patreon for making all of this content possible.